What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, Mtg. We like that magic stuff, and today you read the title of the video right. Congratulations, we got 10 rotating cards for you that could have been great, but just never were. And most importantly, why? Because I know there's going to be people in the comments section typing this right now as we speak, even though you've only seen 5 seconds of the video. You're already saying, hey Dev, bit of a pointless video. Not at all, at least to my mind. Of course, I'm a little bit biased. I'm the one making the video, but I think that there's definitely a lesson that can be learned, even from cards that turned out to be complete and total duds. And then we get to take said lessons into the next spoiler season and apply them when evaluating cards. I think it's an important exercise. Plus, on top of that, I guess I get to effectively eulogize a bunch of cards that didn't see the play they deserved. And I guess one final caveat before we get into it. When I say see play, I mean high-level play. A lot of the cards on this list are going to be Brewer's Choice cards that you've probably seen a lot of on YouTube, this channel included. But I'm specifically talking about cards that saw literally no play. For that reason, there's going to be a lot of cards that you might think are on this list, but actually saw too much play to even make this list. Things like Hero Precinct 1. Esper Hero was a real deck for like 2 seasons in a row, so it doesn't make the cut. Eternal Kefnet actually saw play for the first 2 months. It was available to use in Standard, doesn't count. Niv Mizzet Reborn was in the 5-color Fires deck. Way too much play to be on this list. Tristani Discordant, you may have forgotten, a lot of people did, but Green-White Tokens was an actual deck for 6 weeks when Ravnica first came out. Aside from that, there's a bunch of Planeswalkers like Gideon, Karn. Both of these actually saw a little bit too much play to be on this list. Same thing with 6-mana Chandra and 5-mana Nicole Bolas. So we are really trying to scrape the bottom of the barrel here to find cards that deserve to see play and yet never did. And I guess before we get into it, I'm supposed to tell you to like and subscribe. Link to the Patreon in the description down there. Follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev and watch me play Magic on Twitch at also SBMTGDev. But I'm terrible at self-promotion, and I'll stop now until we get to the end of the video. Now, I want to go into the honorable mention because we've already been talking for a very long time without actually talking about the list. So my honorable mention this time around is Underrealm Lich. Now, Lich is a classic example of a card that looks really cool on paper, but there are so many factors against it in the given standard that it doesn't actually have a chance to see play. It costs a little bit too much, and the other 5 drops in the format we have access to are just much more powerful. Would you rather play Underrealm Lich or Nissa? If you picked Underrealm Lich, you're very likely wrong in that situation because Nissa is just the much stronger card and will lead to winning more games. She also does something when she enters the battlefield, which Underrealm Lich does not do, something else that famously keeps creatures from seeing play. Aside from that, when the card first came out, the most important Golgari deck was the Green-Black Explorer deck that used Wild Growth Walkers and a bunch of cheap Explorer creatures like Seeker Squire, and it just did not have room for a 5-drop. Even though this does interact fairly well with Explorer, it just wasn't right for that deck because it's way too expensive for what that deck was trying to do. In the end, though, this fooled an awful lot of us when it first got spoiled because it's kind of a callback to Sylvan Library, and Sylvan Library gets people extremely hype. I know it's not Sylvan Library, but it filters cards and there's a way to pay for life, so it's the obvious callback. But either way, there's a lot of lessons to learn from this card. But let's get on to the actual list here. That was the longest honorable mention ever, but we got to talk about Lotus Field to actually start the real list here. I was a huge fan, as were many people, of the original Lotus Veil from Weatherlight, one of my favorite old school cards from when I first started playing the game, or at least my first few years of playing the game. I was hyped for this because I thought it was basically Lotus Veil. It is not. It's nowhere near as good as Lotus Veil. And Lotus Veil, here's the tip, wasn't actually super good back in the day in terms of higher level play either, but I had some hopes for this given that there were decks that tried to use it. There was a Bant deck that used Lotus Field with Brought Back. That seemed like it had some promise but never really made the top tables. Same thing with the Kiora deck that played Lotus Field. Just did not end up working out in top level play, so we didn't see much Lotus Field and eventually faded into the background of cards we rarely think about anymore, which is a real shame. It had a lot of cards that worked with it in this format, things like Elvish Reclaimer, for instance, that puts lands into the graveyard and can go search up this if you wanted to. We've also got Cavalier Flame in this format. You can put those 2 lands in the graveyard for Lotus Field and then eventually get some sort of damage payback for that by, killing Cavalier Flame. So there were a few cards that worked pretty well with Lotus Field in this environment, not to mention, again, Kiora. So I thought maybe Lotus Field would get some sort of action, but a lot like Lotus Veil, all hype, no bite. But moving on to number 9, a card that I just mentioned a second ago actually, and that's Brought Back. I wanted these two cards, Lotus Field and Brought Back, to be on the list one after the other, but I think Brought Back is actually the more powerful piece on its face than Lotus Field by a lot. The combo potential on this is very high. They just never gave us anything to really combo with it. There were some promising things like Priest of Forgotten Gods and of course again Lotus Field, but in the end they just did not provide the goods to make Brought Back a good combo piece in this format. It just never happened. In every new set that came out, I was specifically eagle-eyed looking for stuff that worked well with Brought Back, but we just never got the killer combo it seems like we were promised. Of course, though, if you like to play older formats, anything from Historic all the way back to Legacy, then keep an eye out whenever new cards are spoiled from this day forward, because eventually I feel like they'll print something broken with Brought Back. They just refused to do it while it was in Standard. But number 8 is an example of a card that bucks the trend of the last couple of entries on the list. Both Brought Back and Lotus Field are sweet-looking cards that just don't have enough interactive elements or synergistic pieces that combo well with them in order to be good cards. But in the case of Finale of Promise, we knew exactly what to do with this card from the day we first saw it. It goes with Arclight Phoenix. The only problem is there's one card in this format that's so heavily played and shuts down Finale of Promise so thoroughly that Finale never actually got to see any play. Teferi Time Raveler, or 3 Fairy as he's not so affectionately known. Just look at the passive ability on this Planeswalker. Well, if you read it, you may notice that you can only cast spells at any time you can play a sorcery. That means that you can't cast the spells that you get with Finale of Promise. So, the fact that Teferi shows up in, 30 or more % of matchups in Standard meant that Finale of Promise was never actually able to fulfill its promise, and that's a shame. But for number 7, I couldn't decide between Teysa Karlov and Yarok, so they're just both number 7. I guess these are somewhat similar in that they're kind of panharmonic-y and they double up dice, triggers, and whatnot, and there's just so many cool things you could do with that, from Cruel Celebrant to the Afterlife mechanic. But it just never really took off. Neither one of them did, because again, just like some other cards we've already talked about on this list, they are 4 and 5 mana creatures respectively that don't do anything the turn they enter the battlefield and usually don't generate any real value unless you have a free way to sacrifice things that turn, which is not also guaranteed. So, both of these are summoning sick. Both of these usually require more mana to be pumped into them to actually, come to fruition in terms of the coolest stuff you can do with them. And when they already cost so much mana to begin with, you really don't want to have to untap with them on the table for them to really do cool stuff. One way or the other, either they're going to die or you're going to just die before it actually comes around to your next turn. And both of those things are so statistically likely that these cards never actually saw the light of day in Standard. And again, shame. These are both very, very fun, sweet cards that once they do get a chance to start going off, they do just that. But there's a hostile Standard environment to 4 and 5 mana creatures that you have to wait a turn to do anything with. And number 6 is Mausoleum Secrets. There's so many things in this environment that let you mill yourself. Timurit Calls the Dead, Glowspore Shaman, and too many other cards to count. So I thought that Mausoleum Secrets would eventually see play, especially when we got the escape mechanic, which yes, does make you pull cards out of your graveyard, but I figured we'd see an uptick in people milling themselves to put cards in their graveyard to fuel escape, meaning maybe we'd see more Mausoleum Secrets, but it was never meant to be. A 2-mana tutor that allows you to go get any black card in your deck, especially if you top deck it in the late game or you've milled a sufficient number of cards. You can get literally anything with Secrets for just 2 mana, and I was sure that was going to be enough, and so were many other players, but it just never worked out. There are some deck building restrictions to this card, given that you have to play a number of cards that mill you. You have to play a sufficient number of creatures to make the undergrowth mechanic work. You have to play a big enough target to want to go get with Mausoleum Secrets, be it a large creature, an artifact like Bolas's Citadel, or some sort of combo piece. All of these things didn't come together in the end, because not only do you need to play all of those cards, a tutor target, 30 different creatures, cards that mill you. At the end of the day, you don't have all the room left for non-creature spells and things that don't contribute to the combo, so maybe Mausoleum Secrets just never made the cut at the end of the day, even as a 1 or 2 of. But in the back of my mind, this is still a very, very powerful looking Magic card that, as early as turn 3 in this environment, can go search up a lot of very powerful cards in your deck. And number 5 is Prime Speaker Vanafar, and I think if we're going to learn a lesson from this, it's how does Wizards design cards that are based around older cards? Because I feel like Prime Speaker Vanafar is the product of a meeting that went, how do we make Birthing Pod bad? Well, here's how we pull it off. We force the players to pay 4 mana for it rather than just 3. They can't play it in any deck either, by the way. Also, let's give it Summoning Sickness. Let's make it a creature, both so it can't tap when it enters the battlefield, and so it's easier to kill than an artifact. So boom, there you go. We just made Birthing Pod a terrible Magic card, but people are still going to be really excited. And that's exactly how that mess went down right there. Vanafar got spoiled, and people absolutely lost their minds, and then she wasn't in any actual top 8 or top 16 deck over the last 2 years. Birthing Pod looks really sweet, but it turns out Neoform was a better card, and Neoform didn't even really see that much play at the end of the day. But with number 4, we have the ultimate big, stupid, overstated creature that didn't end up seeing play this time around, and that is Doom Whisperer. There's usually one of these in just about every set, a big, dumb thing people freak out about when they see it, because look at those stats for that mana cost, and then it sees no actual play. I think the lesson to learn from a card like Doom Whisperer is not only do your things have to cost little mana and do something when they enter the battlefield, and you could argue that Doom Whisperer does something when it enters the battlefield, but it doesn't actually affect the board state in any way other than being a big guy, and that's almost never good enough in Standard. But I think the further lesson here is that if you are going to play large overstated creatures, they have to cost you relatively little to play, and 5 mana is too much. A good example of what I'm talking about here is Rotting Regisaur, another card that rotates but actually saw all of the play in the world, and that's because 3 mana for a 7/6 is an unbelievable deal, even if it doesn't do anything. Even if it has a downside, that kind of monster on your curve on turn 3, or sometimes even 2, depending on your deck, if you got Gilded Goose or whatever, then that is probably worth it. But a 6/6 Flample on turn 4, if you ramp into it, not quite as worth it as a 7/6 on turn 3 in terms of what turns matter the most. This is a game right now where, especially in Standard, the most important turns are turns 2, 3, and 4. And honestly, if you have to play a big bomb that doesn't do anything on any turn later than those turns, then you're really losing a tempo race 9 times out of 10. And Doom Whisperer is a great example of that. It's also a card, and all creatures are like this in Standard right now, but especially big dumb creatures that don't gain any actual value for you. There's just too many hostile elements. We've got Elspeth Conquers Death in this format. We've got Teferi in the format to bounce Doom Whisperer. We've got Brazen Borrower in the format to bounce Doom Whisperer. And if you just spent all 5 of your mana on turn 5 to effectively get time walked by getting your Doom Whisperer bounced, then that is just the worst feel bad in the world, and it probably loses the game for you. So we just could not play, for all kinds of reasons, we just could not play big, dumb, overstated creatures that cost 4 and 5 mana and don't actually generate value. There's a lot of reasons for that, but I think Doom Whisperer is the most representative of it. I also wanted to put Roalesk in this slot, but I think Doom Whisperer is just a better example in terms of cards that saw hype, but no real play. But there's a rotating card that actually goes against one of the exceptions to the big creature rule. Usually if you want to play big dumb creatures, you can, so long as they have flash and they are your control finishers. But we saw a creature perfect for that this time around that didn't actually see play, and again, there are environmental factors to that. Number 3 is Angel of Grace. Now, as a 5-drop flash creature, this looks perfect as a control finisher, but for the first few months it was in Standard, we had Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, which was just a much better 5-mana option in terms of control finishers. Later, we had 3-mana Teferi. Teferis are always keeping this card down, but we had 3-mana Teferi, whose passive ability completely negates the flash aspect of this card and turns it into kind of a vanilla 5/4 flyer, which is not too great. And to be honest, its ability to exile from the graveyard and get you back to 10 life is very, very expensive and often not enough against aggro board states. So honestly, this card just didn't have the juice to be a contender in Standard, but it also had a hostile Standard environment that wasn't allowing it to be played at instant speed, and if you did play it at instant speed, there are ways that you can just get it bounced, and that still hurts even if you did it on your opponent's turn. We had Elspeth Conquers Death, and again, Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, as much better 5-mana plays than Angel of Grace as well, so there was a lot keeping this card's head underwater. But for number 2, let's look at Moonmoo Yan Ling. I just tweeted about this card the other day, and it was kind of why I wanted to do this list in the first place. Why did Moonmoo Yan Ling not see play? But then I answered myself, with the next tweet, which was basically because we had both 3 mana Teferi and 3 mana Narset in the same format, and you only have so many slots for not just 3-drops, but 3-drop Planeswalkers. Once you get your 4-of Teferi and your 2 to 4 of Narset, you just don't really have room for a card like Moonmoo Yan Ling anymore because those cards completely outclass it. That said, I think there's an alternate reality where either Teferi or Narset or both didn't get printed, and Moonmoo Yan Ling was a very, very playable standard card, as I certainly believe that it would have been if we didn't get these Planeswalkers. But in any other standard environment, we'd probably see some playing of Moonmoo Yan Ling, because not only are 3-mana Planeswalkers somewhat powerful just on their own, but this one has specifically very powerful abilities. It does protect itself the turn it comes down by shrinking a creature and grounding it, and the second turn it's out, it can often make a 4/4 flyer on turn 4, which is really good tempo considering you didn't pay any mana on that turn for it. I personally have hit the ultimate on this card multiple times while playing Magic, and it feels really, really good. It's an extremely powerful ultimate. So at the end of the day, I was surprised this card didn't see any play, but I can definitely understand why. This time the lesson is that when you have better cards at the same type, in the same color, at the same converted mana cost, you gotta make hard cuts, and I feel like Moonmoo Yan Ling was one of those cuts. But we're at number 1, everybody, and that means I get to do this meme one more time, ladies and gentlemen. It's Chamber Sentry! Game of the Year, Chamber Sentry, right here. But no, I'm actually serious, despite the fact that I've turned Chamber Sentry into meme over the last couple of years, and it's one of the things I'm most known for on this channel. I'm that guy that likes Chamber Sentry, but this is one of the last times I'll ever get to talk about Chambo Centro here, and that's really sad for me unless I start playing Historic, while I will continue to try and make this card work. But there were just so many things going for it that I was very surprised the entire time it was in Standard that it ended up being overlooked. There are so many little holes this card can go into. Not only does it fill out your curve in a similar way to a card like, say, Stonecoil Serpent, but it can also shoot your opponent in the head. It can shoot a creature down. That's very important. It can reanimate itself. Just about any color deck can play it, but especially 3-color decks, and there's a lot of those in this environment. We have things like Chromatic Lantern and Dryad of Elysian Grove, 2 separate cards that make your lands produce any color mana, but somehow, even with all of that, Chamber Sentry was not able to muster a comeback. Not even a comeback, but just, you know, a name for itself in the first place. When I first saw this, me and a lot of other people thought that it was going to be the next coming of Walking Ballista, or that it was at least a fixed but playable version of Walking Ballista. The problem is, not that many people thought the playable part of that sentence applied whatsoever. Some people looked at this as a fixed Walking Ballista. That was terrible, but just the other day on stream, I got bodied by a Lotus deck playing Chamber Sentry over and over. The 40 of you that were there and saw that, thank you for being there. By the way, watch me play Magic on Twitch, SPMTG Dev. Anyway, that's just another deck that can take advantage of Chamber Sentry, is the Lurrus deck. Decks with Cruel Celebrant, I've seen this multiple times, decks with Cruel Celebrant and similar cards to it will play 4 copies of Chamber Sentry, 4 copies of Stonecoil Serpent, 4 copies of Ugin's Conjurant, 4 copies of anything that cost X to play and nothing else. That way they can play it for free and get the dice triggers off of Cruel Celebrant. That's a deck that exists, but it didn't ever actually see real mainstream top-level tournament play. Again, this card does so many little things for so many decks, whether it's just an artifact in the Artifacts Matters deck, it's a 0-cost thing for those Cruel Celebrant decks, it's a thing for Chromatic Lantern players to take advantage of, it's a reanimatable piece, it can shoot your opponent down, it can kill their creatures, it can just keep coming back as a 5/5 no matter what you want to do. Chamber Sentry does it. You want to fill out your curve? Chamber Sentry does it. I just still love everything about this card, and I will die on this hill, I promise you, YouTube. Chamber Sentry should have seen more play than it did. But that's pretty much all I got for this list. What cards did I miss? Anything I failed to eulogize in this video, make sure you properly eulogize in the comments section, and let me know what your favorite cards were that never saw the play they deserved. Aside from that, help me out with the algorithm by both liking, subscribing, and I guess a third option is to hit the bell for the notifications. To do that, you can follow me on Twitter at SPMTGDev. That's how you know I'm about to start streaming, and if you want to see me stream, you can catch me on Twitch at SPMTGDev. I'm probably going to do like one YouTube stream a week or every 2 weeks just to see how the metrics work out, but for now I'm on Twitch, and you can check out the Patreon if you want to help vote on what content we do here on the channel at patreon.com/SPMTG. Last thing I need to do is give a shout out to TCG Player. I am not selling anything in this video, but I guess here's a TCG Player tip. instead of trying to sell you stuff. I won't leave a link, but go to tcgplayer.com, click on Magic, and a wealth of options will open up. Then you can hit either articles or decks and go from there. They got a bunch of decks on their website that just won a bunch of tournaments. They have user-generated decks, and if you go to articles, then you'll sometimes see stuff from your dudes. So yeah, if you don't do that, it will greatly improve your experience with TCG Player. So try that out. But aside from that, I'm done, I guess. I'd like to keep talking, but my camera's busted, so this is probably a lot more boring of a video than it should have been, because you can't see my beautiful, gorgeous face in glorious 4K. I don't know why, but my camera won't record more than 5 minutes of video. So here I am, you can't see me. But yeah, I'm very bad at self-promotion, and I'm also very awkward, and I don't know how to end things or say goodbye. So I guess, yeah, I'll start the goodbye spiel now. I'll catch you cats later. I'm Deb from the place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.